Welcome back to Good Morning Sri Lanka. We are still talking about gender-based violence, commemorating the 16 days of campaign. Right now, we were actually talking about how Sri Lankan culture gives a little bit of cover-up to domestic violence, and how we should actually come out and give it out into the laws. So yeah, like Shiruni was saying, anything else that you would like to add up into that?
Well, only that, I mean, as Cholini was saying about the Domestic Violence Act, I think that was a huge leap forward for us, also culturally, socially, legally. But what's also important about it is that it doesn't criminalize the behavior as such. What it does is give an opportunity to the woman, the spouse, who's quite often reluctant to actually take her husband to court for a number of reasons. She may be economically dependent, she may be worried about the kids. So that's really a way for her to get immediate protection from an immediate danger that she's facing.
Yeah. And that is also cultural based, I think.
Well, I think, you see, I don't think we should bring the cultural argument. This is often trotted out because there's an assumption that women must suffer the violence, must suffer the violence in silence. But we don't think the same, say, for instance, about men. We accept the right of men to be free from violence. We don't say, oh, it's a cultural norm, you have to be silent. If a man gets beaten on the street, if he gets tortured in a police station, everybody picks it up. But when the violence occurs in the private sphere, there's an assumption that women must keep quiet, and women themselves sometimes internalize this. But why are we then not talking about the man and the man's responsibility not to be violent? That needs to be part of our culture.
And that's attitudinal,
and I think it is. It is attitudinal. But in Sri Lanka, particularly with a majority Buddhist culture in this country, we need to talk about the question of violence. No? So I think another thing we've done is internalize violence, in that there is such a strong sense of impunity, whether it was the war, whether it is societal violence. There is no real punishment for violence, and therefore perpetrators think they can get away with anything. The attitude of politicians towards violence,
I know, that's quite shocking.
So all of that, and so I think that's the culture we need to break. That's the new culture. To be free from violence is a culture we need to build.
Yes.
And also, just to add to that, you know, in the same way that there's this veil of secrecy around violence within the home, there's also a certain sort of level of covering up, like to use the term that you mentioned earlier, with regard to this kind of behavior within the workplace, I think. So, for instance, you know, preventing sexual harassment in the workplace is something that, for instance, 60 Days Activism Campaign through the Forum for GBV has picked up as one of the key issues, which is looking at having sexual harassment policies or anti-sexual harassment policies within work places. And, you know, for instance, India is way ahead of Sri Lanka in that, you know, there was a Supreme Court judgment which said that all institutions need to have policies and prevent sexual harassment. So, you know, this is also a very different sort of legal culture where you take up these issues to your highest court and you actually get redress with regard to gender and other rights violations. So I think that that's another area where the courts and others can play a big role, as well as institutions. So we know that some institutions, private and government, do have policies on sexual harassment, and we think there's a value in just even having that policy, because then you tell the employees, I mean, even for your institution, whether it's a television or media company or whatever, you know, just to say we have this policy, you socialize it within your institution, because you are making the point that this is wrong.
Yes.
And that itself is of value.
Yeah. Okay. And now when it comes to attitudes, even in workplaces, do you think personally, according to the feedback that you've been getting, according to the work that you've been doing, do you think there is gender discrimination when it comes to workplaces? Is there a discrimination between working women and working men? And do working women get treated a little less better than working men? Does that kind of thing happen? Because according to what I've heard and read, I think there's that sort of thing happening even in metropolitan areas. So what is your opinion on that?
Sorry, me too.
Well, on the question of, say, violence, particularly sexual harassment in the workplace, certainly there is an issue of power imbalance. And you will always find that it is maybe a superior who uses his position of privilege and power to intimidate or harass particularly sexually harass female employees, maybe to ask for favors, to expect favors, you know.
That's very common.
So that certainly in the workplace we see that in very prestigious institutions, whether it's in the educational sector, the medical sector, the legal sector, and like Sarini said, we have the law. We need to bring in policy to make sure that the law is properly implemented.
Yes.
So the question of power imbalance, the question of discrimination, historic discrimination against women, the fact that we see women as citizens of a second class nature, that we look at women's citizenship from the lens of vulnerability, for instance. So when we try to find remedies, we look at how to protect a woman, but that is really not what we are saying. So maybe Shulni and Sani will add to this. I mean, you know, when we talk of say harassment in the public sphere even, or in the workplace, the response is, oh, she was wearing a short skirt, that
happens a lot.
Slit, she provoked. So you're looking at it always from that point of view.
True. That even happens in public transport.
Certainly.
She was dressed in this way, so I was provoked.
The issue is that men do harass or violate, and what are we doing about that?
I think just also to pick up on the whole discrimination angle, you know, the Constitution does prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender, along with lots of other grounds on which you cannot discriminate against women. So I think we need to remember that there's a constitutional guarantee on non-discrimination. There's a constitutional guarantee of equality for men and women.
All right. Even in professional
the thing is that you usually use a fundamental rights jurisdiction mainly against state institutions. So there is this lacuna, this gap with regard to how you hold the private sector accountable. Again, in this country we don't have a national commission on women. So there are other countries that do. For instance, India. I mean, recently they are investigating some very serious allegation with regard to violations of women's rights. Whereas we don't really have that high-level sort of institution that can look into violations. But if there were such a body, what many of us have been very strongly advocating for is to include the private sector there, because, as you said, many of these discriminatory practices do happen within private sector organizations.
Yeah, it's quite common. It's basically work, home and transport. So basically there's no peace
everywhere.
It's everywhere. There's no peace when it comes to violence against women, because it's everywhere. Another very special, I'm just curious to ask it, because now we were talking about gender-based violence and violence against women. So obviously it's not just about violence against women. We have to be women have to be a little educated about how violence against men should be considered as well. Like you said before, that if a wife beats up the husband, he has the same right as the wife who is being beaten up by the husband to go to the courts. Do you see any that sort of issue when it comes to violence against men in Sri Lanka? Is that common? Because I know that in other countries, in the Western countries, especially when it comes to homosexual relationships, people are pretty educated and acknowledged about it. But when it comes in Sri Lanka, is it quite common to be abused and your rights getting violated if you are a man?
I think the reason, maybe Sarini, this will jog your memory, I think there is a recent study done by Care International which says that actually there is a lot of sexual abuse of boys in Sri Lanka, and then those boys, when they grow up, are much more prone to violence against women. I don't know the prevalence of, say, violence against men, because that's not something that we are studying. But I think when we are talking about gender-based violence and violence against women, we are saying that women are vulnerable to violence because of being a woman, whether in the private sphere of the home or in the public sphere.
Simply because you're a woman.
Simply because you're a woman. And there is an issue of power and control, and in patriarchal societies, violence is used by men to control and intimidate women. So it is not just generalized violence we are talking about. This is violence which is particularly directed at women because they're women and because it is used in a context of power and control.
And if you look at the statistics, actually there's a much higher incidence of violence against women.
Of course, definitely.
And that is the question we want to address. Certainly marginalized groups are prone to violence. So like you said, same-sex men in homosexual relationships, or particularly transgender people are the people who get penalized, are the people who are prone to more violence. And so that's an issue. Certainly there are groups working with those segments of society, and in those instances certainly men are violated, but the vast majority of cases we know of.
No, I hear you completely.
And actually, even in terms of sexual abuse, I think there are some recent reports, say by Human Rights Watch, about torture in detention, where both men and women
I've heard that too.
have been sexually tortured, for instance. So I think, like Kumi is saying, so in different contexts, but when we are talking about violence against women, we are talking about violence in a particular sense.
Plainly because they are women. I think that's a very good focus. Okay, unfortunately we've run out of time. So we have to say goodbye for today, but if you need any information on our show, and if you have missed any segment, please go on www.facebook.com and /Good Morning Sri Lanka. Don't forget that part, and go into our YouTube segment as well, which you can search by just typing GMSL. And if you have any feedback, suggestions on anything about our show, and if you have any guest suggestions as well, please mail us in at mtvsports@maharaja.lk. Thank you so much, ladies, for being here. I've learned a lot and I've been very inspired. I hope that you keep doing what you're doing and inspire the society out there and make Sri Lanka a better place. Thank you so much for being here. So time for us to say goodbye. We will see you tomorrow, same time, same channel. So until then, have a lovely day. Don't take this day for granted. Live every moment to the last. Bye bye.